Picture a lawn, any lawn. Maybe it's yours. Someone walks across it barefoot, coffee in hand, not thinking about anything under their feet. Down there, low to the ground, is a small plant with 3 round leaflets and a puff of white flowers. Most people walk right over it. Some people hate it. They spray it, dig it out, curse it for ruining the perfect green lawn. But here's a question worth asking. If this plant is such a nuisance, why is it almost impossible to get rid of? Why does it show up in lawns, fields, parks, and roadsides on nearly every continent? There's a reason this plant refuses to disappear. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why it might be one of the most quietly important plants you've never really looked at. The plant hiding in plain sight. This is white clover, scientific name Trifolium repens. You've seen it 1,000 times. Round leaflets, usually 3, sometimes with a faint pale crescent near the base. Short stems of tiny white flowers, often with a hint of pink. It grows almost everywhere. Temperate grass grows. Lawns, parks, pastures, sports fields, cracks in sidewalks. To a lot of homeowners, that makes it a weed, something that doesn't belong in a proper lawn of uniform grass. But that judgment says more about lawn culture than it does about the plant. White clover isn't invading your yard by accident. It's built to succeed there. And that's where the story actually starts. Why does it grow so well? Grass has one basic strategy: grow fast, spread through the soil with shallow roots, and outcompete for space. Clover plays a different game entirely. Underground, its roots form small nodules, tiny growths that house colonies of soil bacteria called rhizobia. This partnership is remarkable. The bacteria pull nitrogen straight out of the air trapped in the soil and convert it into a form the plant can actually use. In exchange, the clover feeds the bacteria with sugars it makes through photosynthesis. It's a trade, a quiet, underground economy that most people never think about. Researchers studying this partnership in pasture systems have found that clover can get the large majority of its nitrogen this way, which is part of why it thrives even in soil that's too poor to support much else. And here's the twist, that nitrogen doesn't just stay locked inside the clover. As it breaks down in the soil, some of that nitrogen becomes available to nearby plants too, including the very grass that's supposedly competing with it. In other words, the plant people try to rip out may actually be feeding the lawn around it. The flowers everyone ignores. Now look up past the leaves to those small white flower heads. Most people barely register them, but step closer during a warm afternoon and you'll usually hear something, a low hum of activity. White clover produces nectar generously, and it's one of the most reliable food sources for honeybees and bumblebees across much of the temperate world. Beekeepers have long recognized clover fields as a major source of nectar flow. There's an added detail that makes this more interesting. White clover is largely self-incompatible, meaning a single plant generally can't pollinate itself. It needs insects moving between flowers to produce seed at all. In studies where honeybees were the dominant visitors, researchers recorded dramatic increases in seed production compared to plants pollinators couldn't reach. So this plant, dismissed as background noise in a lawn, is actually running a two-way relationship with the insects that keep entire ecosystems moving. Remove the clover, and you remove a food source that pollinators are quietly depending on all summer long. The human history of clover. People noticed clover's usefulness long before anyone understood nitrogen fixation. For centuries, farmers planted clover in pastures because livestock thrived on it, and fields planted with it seemed to grow better crops afterward, even though nobody could explain why at the time. It became one of the most important forage and cover plants in temperate agriculture, valued for feeding animals and quietly renewing tired soil. And then there's the legend everyone knows: luck. White clover almost always grows 3 leaflets, which is actually built into its name. Trifolium literally means 3-leafed, so when a 4th leaflet appears, it stands out immediately. It's the result of a rare genetic and developmental quirk, generally estimated to occur somewhere in the range of 1 in several thousand clovers. That rarity is exactly why it became a symbol. 4-leaf clovers weren't declared lucky because of magic. They became lucky because finding one felt like beating the odds. What people get wrong. Here's where it's worth slowing down, because clover tends to get pushed into one of 2 extremes. To some, it's just a weed, an eyesore to be eliminated from a lawn. To others, online at least, it gets treated almost like a miracle plant, credited with sweeping health claims and near-magical benefits. The truth sits in between, and honestly, the middle ground is more interesting than either extreme. Clover isn't a villain, and it isn't a cure-all. It's a genuinely useful, ecologically active plant that happens to be small enough for us to overlook. What does science actually say? Let's separate this clearly. What we know: clover forms a nitrogen-fixing partnership with soil bacteria. It's a major nectar source for bees. It's used worldwide as livestock forage and as a cover crop to improve soil health. What scientists are still studying. Researchers continue to investigate exactly how much nitrogen different clover varieties can transfer to neighboring plants, how pollinator diversity affects clover seed production, and the genetics behind why some patches produce 4-leaf mutations more often than others. What's mostly traditional: clover has a long folk history in traditional remedies and herbal use in some cultures. That history is real, but it isn't the same thing as modern clinical evidence. Traditional use doesn't automatically mean proven medical benefit, and clover shouldn't be treated as a substitute for medical care. Why this tiny plant matters. Step back, and the picture gets bigger than a single lawn. This plant is quietly linked to soil chemistry, to bee populations, to centuries of farming, to folklore that's spread across entire cultures. It's not just filling space between blades of grass. It's part of a working system, one most people never notice because it never asks to be noticed. Safety and accuracy. A quick practical note: if you ever consider foraging any wild plant, correct identification matters. Mistakes with wild plants can be genuinely dangerous. Never collect plants growing near roadsides, treated lawns, or anywhere chemicals might have been used. And remember, traditional use is not the same as medical proof. If you're dealing with a health concern, talk to an actual healthcare professional, not a plant. So picture that lawn again. Same grass, same warm light, same person walking across it without a second thought. Down at ground level, the clover is still there, still trading sugar for nitrogen with bacteria no one can see, still feeding bees that will carry pollen to a dozen other plants before the day is over, still carrying a name that means 3-leafed, waiting for the rare, statistically unlikely 4th leaf that turned it into folklore. It was never just a weed. It was a small, stubborn plant quietly doing more work than almost anything else in that lawn. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Some of the most overlooked things around us aren't ordinary at all. We just never stopped long enough to ask. Because if a plant this small can hide a story this big, imagine what else is growing right under our feet.